One. Hello and welcome back to That Ages Well. This week I'm joined by Nigel Spivey, who has written The Ancient Olympics, which I'm holding up here. I had the great pleasure of reading while I was in Greece myself. And that, of course, the Ancient Olympics is the topic because tomorrow, by the time this episode is released, the modern Olympics, the Paris Olympics, are coming on Friday 27th, I would say, if I remember correctly. And of course, I gotta begin by asking, are you excited for the Paris Olympics?
I'm not going to be there personally, but yeah, I'm always excited when the Olympics happen. I've become, I mean, I'm a connoisseur of watching things in slow motion. So, and I'm also a bit agoraphobic, which means I don't like large crowds, but in spirit, I would be there. Yeah.
Okay, and of course, let's begin with, as you do in the book, what begin with the sport in ancient Greece world before the Olympics. So let's talk a little bit about the role before forming the Olympics and the role that sport played. Of course, you mentioned that in the Iliad as well, sport plays a role. So let's talk a little bit about sport before the ancient Olympics began.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big topic. Do you want to be more specific about?
Just general sport in, if you wouldn't mind, a general overview of the sport in a little bit. Don't have to talk too much about it because, of course, like I said, the main team is the ancient Olympics. But I wanted to have a little bit understanding of sport before the ancient Olympics began.
I mean, certainly the ancient Greek Olympics were not the first manifestation of sport in society. I think everybody knows that. And that in terms of the evidence for previous cultures performing games or organizing sports festivities, everything is older than we think, I think. So surely back in the Bronze Age, there were sporting events in ancient Egypt. I think there's evidence there as well. And I suspect that it probably goes back, into Neolithic or into prehistory. So some anthropologists, some long-range historians would characterize the human species. There was this Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga, who talked about Homo ludens being the species that likes to play. Now, I'm not saying that no animals like to play. I think most of us have seen dogs in a playful mood. I personally got very excited last year when I was in California and I saw dolphins and seals joining the surfers. And when surfers are with their fully with their wetsuits on, they do look a bit like seals or dolphins. So I wouldn't say that the instinct for play is solely confined to humans, but I think that phrase Homo ludens, the species that likes to play, is part of our imaginative faculty, and that what the Greeks do with the Olympics is create a kind of institutional habitat for sport and organize it in such a way that it's for the participants, and also it becomes a spectacle. And as the Olympics sort of gain in their sort of institutional confidence, they attract more and more people, and they transform, I think, from being something that's was an act of some kind of act of worship. It becomes something not secular, because there's still, it's a temple site and a sanctuary site. But yeah, basically the historical development of the Olympics is that when they come under the control of the Roman Empire, they become something a bit different and something a bit closer to what will be happening in Paris this year, which is that, there's an athletes village, but there's, it's a media event as well. And and broadly speaking, what the Romans did was make it much more comfortable, not only for the athletes, but also for the spectators at Olympia.
Let's begin with do you know when first the Olympics began and the idea behind Olympics? And of course, that as we're going to talk about, the only Greeks in the Greek world were allowed to participate in the Olympics, and the reasoning why no other, and there is why they wouldn't let other races, so to speak, attend in the Olympics.
Now, you bundled up quite a few questions in one, but let's start with the beginning of the Olympics, because I mean the ancient tradition gave a date that we can relate to our chronology of 776 before the Common Era or before Christ, whichever you prefer. But what makes this a tricky question to answer for the historian who likes absolute dates is that the first Olympics, the first Olympiad, is a kind of absolute date for ancient chronology. And so they're counting from Olympics #1 every 4 years. And that becomes, one of their systems of counting. And that persists right through, the reform of the calendar by the Romans and so on. So in a sense, we don't have a comparative measure. I mean, we would call the 776 in our terms, the archaeologists talk about it being part of the Iron Age. It's also, in classical historical terms, called the Archaic period. But for the Greeks, let's say the Greeks in the time of, who's a famous Greek, Socrates or Plato. So Greeks around the time when Athens was flourishing, the Parthenon was built, etc., what we call the classical period, they looked back to that first date of the Olympics as being sort of when history began. So what's before that? Well, as far as they were concerned, it was
irrelevant.
Not so much irrelevant. It was just it was when amazing things happened, and when there were characters like Theseus, Odysseus, all the heroes of the Trojan War. I mean, they were aware, they thought those things had actually happened. And that, there had been a hero, Heracles, and they thought that Heracles once went to this place, Olympia, and with his own footsteps paced out the stadium. So they gave the kind of colorful mythological explanation for how these games had started, but they didn't have a chronology into which they could neatly fit them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because the Olympics were the chronology, and I think this is what we need to understand, that you counted history from the first Olympics, but the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, how much they knew about what had happened at that site, in the prehistoric period. All they would have known is that it was a place that had religious and heroic significance. Because there's a big burial from the Bronze Age there, which they thought was the burial place of a hero called Pelops.
Let's talk about a little bit of a training and how you were recruited to attend in Olympic, because it was obviously a huge deal to be that you were allowed to attend. And the Olympics. So let's talk a little bit about the training and how you were picked out to become a Olympic athlete.
Well, you were picked out. I don't think it was a good festival to go and attend as an athlete if you weren't very good.
Mm.
And in fact, you would not have been allowed to compete if you just were kind of coming
Mediocre.
along like an enthusiastic amateur. You know, in our Olympics, we have a tradition of letting, you know, very small nation states compete with their best athletes who, relatively speaking, may not be very good.
Mm.
That would not have been tolerated in the ancient games. There were local judges who would have seen that someone turning up didn't have much hope and would have excluded them from the competition. So they have a kind of a sortition, is the word one would use, of you know, drawing the best competitors to meet each other, and presumably there were what we would call heats. You know, so you would get to the final of the stadium sprint through a succession of heats. But you had to turn up expecting this to be the toughest competition there was, because there were other festivals. Yeah, so throughout classical antiquity, we know that there were athletic meetings all around the Greek world, and then later all around the Roman Empire. But Olympia always retained this prestige status of being the place that was the most difficult to win.
It was the most prestigious
Of
in a way.
the circuit. I
Yeah.
mean, by the time of the Roman Empire, so the Romans conquer Greece in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. They don't, you know, they keep the Olympics going, and some of the Roman emperors are very keen that it should flourish as a sporting venue. But the Roman Empire, of course, is spread, you know, so far around the Mediterranean and around Europe and in North Africa that it really widens the scope for participation in this. And it's clear from the later records of Olympia that the kind of center of athletic excellence moves, and it moves essentially from west to east. And by the you know, the closing decades of the Roman Empire, looks like the best athletes are coming from Asia and Egypt. But Olympia has still got that status of being, this is where you prove that you're the best.
Let's talk about some of the sporting events that you did participate in the ancient Olympics as well.
Yeah, the program, I mean, when you start talking about the origins of the games, it's you know, it's tempting to say that they were a kind of substitute for warfare, or a kind of training for warfare. So in the original program, or in the early program of the Olympics, there were some events that didn't survive all the way through the ancient period. And one of these was running a race where you carried elements of your infantry armor, big heavy shield, a helmet that made it very difficult for you to see, and leg armor. And so you think, well, was part of the point of the Olympics to keep citizens ready for battle? That kind of, you know, if you ask the question, are you fit? Even in modern English, it begs another question, well, fit for what? And so were they trying to make themselves fit for
For
warfare.
me, the answer would be no.
Sorry?
For me, the answer would be no.
Well, you know, I think people do sport for all sorts of reasons, and among them is a kind of, um, I think nowadays, a sense that it's salutary, it's good for you to do exercise for the sake of your longevity. And some people, you know, practice sport in order to possibly in order to be able to defend themselves. But that question of, you know, the original motivation for these games, it's hard to answer because, you know, as I've said before, there's a historical date in the 8th century for when the games officially start. But our first detailed description of the kinds of things that were performed at the Olympics, like running, wrestling, boxing, racing chariots or horses, we have a description in an early Greek writer, i.e. Homer, who is probably writing not very far away in time from when the date of the first Olympics is given, but he doesn't know about the Olympics. And I think if he had known about the Olympics as games, he would have said something about them. What he describes in parts of the Iliad and indeed in the Odyssey are competitions that take place among heroes, basically to decide which of them is the fastest, the strongest, the most nimble at controlling a chariot or something like that. And so you can argue that what the games are all about is becoming a hero. And I think some of that has lived on in the modern instances.
You quote in the very opening of your book, you quote George Orwell, and that it was war without shooting. So would you elaborate a little bit about how the Olympics can be compared in Orwell's quote, war without shooting?
Yeah, so George Orwell, the English writer, I think he watched a football game between a team from the Soviet Union, as it then was, and Britain, shortly after the Second World War. And he made this observation, which is a very attractive one, sort of journalistically. War minus the shooting, nice definition of sport. So I guess the implication there is that there is some kind of combat or conflict element in sport, which some psychologists would call, you know, like a drive discharge. I think that's the phrase that we use, that, you know, humans are innately aggressive. And one way of explaining the origins of the Olympics is that it would then be a kind of channel or a conduit for this aggression where, yeah, the city-states that made up, so because Greece was never, you know, one nation state in antiquity, it was a whole, you know,
There's a city-states.
Yeah, and some would say that these city-states played out their rivalries at places like Olympia. So they showed each other how strong they were, how powerful they were by the quality of their athletes. Which of course would have had the effect of making all of the competition very political. As you know, you and I, maybe not you, but I can certainly remember times when the modern Olympics were politicized, basically where the, you know, states such as East Germany manifested their strength through their athletes. And the same went on with the Soviet Union versus America. And then, of course, the race element, you know, we've seen in our own times, in 20th century times anyway. how racial politics has come into the Olympics. And I'm sure there was this element in antiquity of a successful state, or a state that wants to appear successful, showing its success through the displays of its athletes.
Let's talk about how they practiced the sport. Just as they did in the gym, it was very much in nude, and I imagine exercising in toga or in tunic would be, especially in the Greek weather, would be quite horrendous. So let's talk about the practice that they practice in nude in the Olympics as well.
Yeah, I mean, the literal translation of the word gymnasium, if you translate its original Greek root meanings, it is a place where you take all your clothes off. And the gym as a institution of a city comes into an existence sometime around the 6th century BCE. So over 2,500 years ago, it becomes an aspect of living in a city that you would expect a city to have a series of institutional features like a marketplace, a sanctuary, a covered area for shopping and meeting and so on, law courts, etc., and a gymnasium. And in the ruins of classical cities today, you can usually locate where was the gymnasium. Sometimes it gets called the wrestling school, the palestra. But anyone who goes to Pompeii, for example, will find that there's not just one, but two gymnasia in Pompeii. I think as soon as you start talking about the Roman world, you can probably forget the idea that you have to take off all your clothes. Okay, just as in a modern gymnasium, it would be an outrageous thing to do. I think it's unlikely that athletes in places like Pompeii stripped completely naked. But we're still not entirely sure about that. But the Greeks themselves thought that it was, a place for formal training. And there would be things like, at a gym, what would you find? A running track, an area for wrestling and boxing, punch bags.
It wasn't too much unlike a modern gym
In that sense, yeah, and it was also a space that, I mean, it was segregated socially. So we know from inscriptions that slaves were not allowed to go to the gym, and anyway, they're probably too exhausted to do such a thing. That if women were permitted to go, they would go at a separate time from the men. But yeah, you could expect to have a workout, and there'd be some place usually where you could not shower, but you could jump into a pool and wash yourself. And I think in somewhere like Athens, classical Athens, let's say again in the time of Socrates, 5th century, late 5th century BCE, going to the gym was like a daily routine. And it became also a social space. So you would meet people there, spend time with them. And of course, this is what is often overlooked, and I don't think transfers to modern times. It was an academic space. So a teacher like Plato or Aristotle, where do they set up their classrooms? At a gym. So Academos was a gym in Athens. The Lyceum was a gym where Aristotle set up his school. Because you have young men who are citizens, and they're not really employed in any kind of way that corresponds to our modern sense of employment. They've got time on their hands, they've got time to go to the gym, and they've got time to study. And the two things kind of go together, I think.
Let's talk about the prize winning of the games, because it could be quite high prices. And of course, we talked about prestige as well. You had kind of the village era, right? If you won your Olympic sport. So let's talk a little bit about winning and the price price of winning the Olympics, because it was much. I think for especially back then compared to the Olympics today, you see a much more higher price you could win if you won the ancient Olympics than today.
Um, I think that's debatable. I wonder how much it is worth to an athlete. It probably depends which discipline you do today, but I would have thought in terms of sponsorship deals, um, a really successful athlete might be able to kind of base the rest of their life on an Olympic victory. Certainly in antiquity, in ancient times, that was probably the case. That if you won at Olympia, okay, symbolically, you get a crown of olive leaves, which is, in monetary terms, in itself is worth nothing. But the prestige, the kudos, the Greeks called it, the attendant rewards that you got for that.
It was the equivalent of a gold medal.
Yes, except that it was worth, the gold medal as its weight in gold is perhaps, of secondary importance, just as the wreath, the olive wreath, the wreath of olive leaves was in antiquity. But at these athletic festivals, and not just at Olympia, but other festivals, it's clear that you would get some kind of reward that had a cash value. So at some athletics festivals, you would get a huge quantity of olive oil. And just think of that as liquid gold, because you could sell that and it would be worth, it was a lot of oil that you could, as it were, cash in. Some city-states sponsored their athletes by offering them, the family of the athletes would get some kind of pension. They'd be given sort of special privileges back in their hometowns. And eventually the whole circuit, of which Olympia was part, provided a living for, so someone who's a great boxer, let's say in the time of Augustus, early Roman Empire, can go from one competition to another, one meeting to another around the Mediterranean, winning these prizes, cash value, and so long as they don't do too much damage to themselves, retiring on the proceeds as a successful athlete.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about the audience as well, because as you described, it wasn't always enjoyable, perhaps in ancient time, to even participate or watch the Olympics, and of course, women were most of the time not allowed in the games.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to remember that at least the early period of the Olympic Games. So really, we're talking about half a millennium before the Romans bring decent facilities and amenities and good supply of fresh water, etc., to the site. If you've been to Olympia, it's in a part of Greece in the Peloponnese that August and September, which is when the Olympic festival would happen, most Greeks prefer to go to the seaside or to the islands then, because it's humid, it's inland, and it's not a great time to be at Olympia. And it's almost as if they chose that time deliberately to make it more of a test. And so in this early period, there's no accommodation for the athletes. They just have to camp or just live rough. There's no, the water supplies have not been, nicely channeled by the Romans. And it was recognized to be a real test of your endurance. And the same would go for the athletes or the spectators. You know, it was tough. It was hot, and the period of the festival, you had to be pretty healthy, I think, just to survive it.
Let's talk about how at the end of the ancient Olympics, as we consider it, and how the end, and of course revival in the early modern era, and how what caused the end of the ancient Olympics, and the revival of the modern Olympics.
Yeah, it's the end of the Olympics came about not because everyone had stopped doing athletics. Yeah, we know that as the Roman Empire became progressively, well, as it transformed into the Christian Byzantine Empire, there was no reason for Christians to feel angry about athletics as such, although I suspect they wouldn't have liked the habit of nudity in a gymnasium or in statues of famous athletes. What caused the close down of Olympia was the practice of animal sacrifice, which in terms of the ancient pagan rituals at the sanctuary demanded that a successful athlete marked their success by sacrificing animals, quite large animals, to the local deity, who was not just the local deity, Zeus, but he's also the sort of patriarchal Olympic deity of all the Olympian deities. And it's the practice of killing animals at altars, at temples, that is forbidden by emperors coming after Constantine, that forces the sanctuary to close down. And archaeologists also think that the whole area, I mean, I've mentioned that it was, it's not, it's an unhealthy place, or it was an unhealthy place to be. And it seems to be that malaria became a problem, and the rivers silted up. There are two rivers that go through the site of Olympia. They silted up, so presumably there was stagnant water, and so the mosquitoes became a real problem. So the site was kind of abandoned, and in fact, it sort of got lost during the Middle Ages, and it was only in the 18th century that people started looking for it, getting curious, because there were descriptions in ancient authors about the site and what a splendid site it had been. Splendid partly because of the temples, but splendid also because one of the marks of being a successful athlete was that you would put up either a thanksgiving to the gods for your victory, or you would be honored with a statue. And I think it's difficult to imagine in Olympia today, but it's described really as like a sort of forest of statues of mostly very admirable and beautiful looking human beings in marble and bronze. And so archaeologists or at least antiquarians who were reading about the site of Olympia, the obvious name, or at least it's obvious for a classical scholar, is somebody called Winkelmann, who was a German scholar based in Rome, who dreamed about going to excavate this site of Olympia. If only he could find it, and if only it were possible to get there to do the digging for it. He knew that there would be a lot of statues discovered. But actually, as it happened, the excavations don't start properly. I mean, there were a few minor excavations before this, but it's really only in the later 19th century that the German archaeologists cooperating with the Greeks start formal excavations. And it's around that time that you have this dream of resuscitating festival. I mean, if you know about the story of Pierre de Coubertin, you know, he wasn't himself an archaeologist, and in fact, I think what gave him, you know, at least part of his idea for rekindling the Olympic fire was his experience of touring around in Britain and seeing these festivals, local festivals of sporting contests, going to what's in Britain we call public schools, which are private schools, such as Eton and Rugby, where they played games that de Coubertin thought were played in a kind of, they were a channel of aggression. They were good character building tests of, well, he would have called it manliness, but let's broaden it to the human spirit more generally. And he kind of made a sort of connection between what was happening in this part of Europe and what had happened at Olympia in antiquity. And the result was this a revived Olympics.
Now the idea of course, that we have the Olympic fire that people did for the opening ceremony, that, and of course this is another episode in itself, that doesn't come until the Nazi Olympics in 1936.
Yeah.
So there wasn't really any opening ceremony where they run with the fire and put the everlasting fire on until the Nazi Olympics in 36.
Yeah, I mean, the Olympics have gone through, the modern Olympics have gone through all sorts of developments and transformations. And when they were, when the Olympics were relaunched in Athens at the end of the 19th century, I don't think anyone could quite foresee how they would become the sort of big international media events that they have become. But I think even from the outset, there were, you know, it wasn't a kind of pedantic replica of the ancient Olympics, you know, so there were, you know, events. I mean, the event that I used to do at an amateur level, throwing the hammer, that was never part of the ancient program. That's come from a Celtic, Northern European tradition of games. The marathon, despite its name, you know, there wasn't a long distance race at the ancient Olympics. The reason being was that long distance running was kind of a professional, and you had messengers who were accustomed to taking information from one place to another, running. Believe it or not, humans can run faster than horses over some distances. But because it had an ancient association with the distance of the Battle of Marathon, it got the sense that it was an ancient event. Yeah.
Are there similar? You kind of answered this a little bit already, but I want to kind of ask, if for lack of better words, again, are there similarities we can draw from the modern Olympics and the ancient Olympics?
Other similarities between, well, obviously,
You mentioned that marathon and the some other sports, but like sport-wise and in general, are the similarities we can draw?
I mean, I think to go back to this idea of becoming a hero by your performance at the games, I think that is one quite key element of similarity that possibly even wasn't foreseen by Pierre de Coubertin, because this idea that what was important for him was a much more not softer approach, but this idea that, you know, go out there and do your best,
Mm.
and don't worry too much. It's the taking part, not the winning. I think most of us, both who've participated in sport and who watch sport eagerly, might like to think that winning is paramount. And in that sense, I think the spirit of the ancient Olympics is still very much alive.
Mm.
Yeah, so at the ancient Olympics, coming second is no good.
Mm.
Okay, so the silver medal,
Mm.
bronze medal, they don't really count
Yeah.
in the ancient Olympics. But if you get that first position,
Mm.
then you achieve this heroic status.
I think the ancient Greeks would be baffled at the cost that it takes to build and prepare for the modern Olympics. The amount of cost and hours it takes to prepare just a stadium, or the only prepare for the tourists that come in to watch these games in as a whole. I think it will be quite mind blown to see how much time it takes.
Yeah, they would. And I think, I don't know about the ancient Greeks, but I think the ancient Romans, especially some of the Roman emperors, uh, would have thought it was much more sensible to have one place,
Yeah.
something like Olympia, where you have this regular uh, uh, meeting on a 4-yearly basis, so that it doesn't have to be, a financial onus on a city.
It takes a tremendous amount of resources, and just I mean, look at how disastrous kind of the Chinese Olympics were, because they didn't prepare enough facilities for prepare well enough for the athletes that were in China in the Winter Olympics in 2022. So, and forgive me if I don't remember the year, but it's almost ridiculous at this point. And the opening ceremony in itself, it's tremendous amount of cost just to host the Olympics.
I agree. Yeah. I know I'm it's not my problem on that front, but
Fortunately,
I
for
think one thing to say about the ancient Olympics is that the Romans, and in particular some Roman emperors who've not otherwise got a good reputation. For example, the Emperor Nero, who is usually regarded at a popular level as a bit of a villain, was very enthusiastic about athletics generally, and about the Olympics in particular. And it's under his patronage and other eminent people in the Roman Empire that that whole site of Olympia becomes a more pleasant place to be.
and you're gonna run it up in a few seconds, but I'm gonna ask a little bit silly question, of course, at the end. And what are your thoughts on Asterix and the Olympics?
Oh,
But
I haven't read that for a long time. Presumably Obelix wins something. I
that's doping, though, in a way. Obelix kind of it's kind of doping, though.
Yeah. I mean, in the museum at Olympia, there is a really big, I think it's in the museum. There's this enormous stone with an inscription that says so and so lifted me over his head. And it was obviously some feat of strength, but one can imagine Obelix turning up. But no, seriously, I mean, one of the important things to recognize about the ancient Olympics as they developed in the Roman Empire is that originally they had been confined to people who were from the Greek city-states. But under the Roman Empire, they became much more cosmopolitan. And so it would not have been crazy to have someone from northeast France or wherever, northwest France, is it, where Asterix and Obelix come from. It would not have been unthinkable for a citizen of
There is a
Rome.
minor flaw, however, because they resist Roman rule, and because you had to be Roman to attend the Olympics, if I remember correctly, at least in the Asterix and Obelix comics, they kind of admit defeat when they want to go attend the Olympics. That we are Romans, so let's generally just admitted defeat to Rome. So they kind of admit defeat in that comic. So there is some
Do they?
minor little flaw there. Just want to point that out.
I'm sorry about that.
Now, and we're gonna round it up now. And of course, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Before you go, of course, do you have anything you want to promote and recent work you want to share? Or of course, where can people find your book, The Ancient Olympics, if they want to read
The Ancient Olympics.
about the Ancient Olympics so in your work, and of course, and social media, where if people have any further questions about the Ancient Olympics that they may want to ask, that we didn't take it.
Well, there is a new book out by somebody. It's a British publishing house called Bloomsbury, and I think it's just come out in paperback. A Cultural History of Sport. There's a lot of up-to-date work about the ancient Olympics and how they changed in that. So that's quite a good place to get further information from. Bloomsbury, Cultural History of Sport. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. And this has been That Aged Well. You can find us on Twitter/X under That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, also on Instagram and That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. That would be very nice. If you like this episode, please check out some others as well. We have some great episodes coming out. You don't want to miss them. This has been That Aged Well. My name is Adam. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. And before I go, I hope you enjoy the Paris Olympics that are coming out tomorrow. Take care.